In the sweltering heat of a Georgia plantation, under a sky heavy with unspoken burdens, a young enslaved man named Elias hunched over a makeshift fire, stirring a bubbling pot that reeked of herbs and desperation. It was 1825, and the air was thick with the cries of the afflicted, those struck down by a fever that swept through the fields like a silent reaper. Elias's hands, scarred from years of labor, moved with a quiet precision born not of freedom, but of survival. He whispered ancient words, half-remembered from stories passed in the dead of night, as he added a pinch of something wild, something forbidden. That night, as the mixture cooled into a murky elixir, the first man who drank it rose from his sickbed, his fever broken. But Elias's triumph was short-lived. The overseer watched from the shadows, eyes narrowed with suspicion. What if this crazy brew could change everything or destroy it? Before we continue, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The story of Elias Thorne begins not in glory, but in the shadowed underbelly of America's deepest scars. Born into bondage on the sprawling hawthorn plantation in the heart of rural Georgia, Elias was no ordinary field hand. From a tender age, he displayed a curiosity that set him apart, a hunger for the world's hidden mechanics that the chains around his ankles could not suppress. His mother, a healer from the West African coasts, had smuggled fragments of knowledge across the Middle Passage, the properties of roots, the alchemy of leaves, the way certain barks could staunch blood or soothe fevered brows. She taught him in whispers under the cover of moonless nights before she was taken by the same illnesses she fought to cure. "Knowledge is the only fire they can't put out," she would say, her voice a fragile thread against the roar of the cotton gin. The hawthorn plantation was a kingdom of illusion, where white columns masked the rot beneath. Owned by the formidable Jeremiah Hawthorne, a man whose wealth was built on the bent backs of over 200 souls, the estate sprawled across thousands of acres of fertile red clay. Officially, it was a model of Southern efficiency. Records in county ledgers praised its yields, its orderly quarters, its pious Sunday gatherings where slaves were paraded as evidence of benevolent mastery. But beneath this facade lay a labyrinth of silences. Families torn asunder by auctions, punishments doled out in the dark, and a systematic cruelty that extended far beyond the whip. Hawthorne, a widower with ambitions that stretched to state politics, enforced a code of absolute control. Whispers among the enslaved spoke of the program, a euphemism for the forced pairings designed to bolster the workforce, ensuring a steady supply of hands for the endless harvest. Women were selected like livestock, their pleas swallowed by the plantation's vast isolation. Men like Elias, strong and skilled, were both prized and perilous, their spirits a threat to the order. Elias's path to the mixture that would upend medical history was paved with such shadows. As a boy, he had been pulled from the fields and assigned to the big house, where his quick mind caught the eye of Hawthorne's ailing sister, Eliza. She was a fragile figure, bedridden with consumption, surrounded by apothecary jars imported from Europe, powders and tinctures that promised miracles but delivered only dust. Elias, barely 16, was tasked with tending her, grinding herbs under her watchful eye. Eliza, educated in Philadelphia salons, saw in him a mirror of her own intellect. In stolen moments she shared books, rudimentary chemistry texts, observations on distillation, tales of alchemists who turned base metals to gold. "The body is a vessel," she told him once, her voice rasping through a silk handkerchief. "Mix the right elements, and you command life itself." But Eliza's lessons came at a cost. Hawthorne tolerated them only because they amused his sister, a diversion from the plantation's grim realities. Elias absorbed it all, his mind a secret forge, hammering knowledge into tools for endurance. By his early 20s, Elias had become the plantation's unofficial healer, a role thrust upon him when cholera ripped through the quarters in 1823. Dozens fell, their bodies racked with cramps and delirium, the air foul with waste and despair. The local doctor, a portly man from Savannah who arrived on horseback with his black bag, prescribed bleedings and prayers, but his visits were perfunctory, his fees steep. Hawthorne, ever the pragmatist, forbade burials until the fever passed, fearing it would halt the harvest. In the slave quarters, fear festered like an open wound. Mothers clutched children to their chests, elders invoked spirits long banished by the crossing. Elias, remembering his mother's remedies, began experimenting in secret. He foraged at dawn for sassafras roots and willow bark, bartered with passing traders for sulfur and lime. In a hidden corner of the smokehouse, he boiled and strained, testing on the weakest first, a child named Lila, whose skin burned like fire. The breakthrough came amid that cholera scourge, but its roots stretched deeper, into the unspoken horrors of the plantation. Elias's mixture was no accident of genius. It was born of necessity, a desperate bid to counter the abuses that bred disease. The program Hawthorne enforced left lasting marks. Women weakened by repeated pregnancies, men broken by overwork, all vulnerable to infection in the fetid quarters. Elias had seen friends punished for minor infractions, tied to posts and left under the sun until they collapsed, their bodies easy prey for fever. One night, as he tended to Josiah, a fellow bondsman lashed for refusing a forced union, Elias noticed how the man's wounds festered not just from the whip, but from the invisible rot of unclean water and unwashed linens. Drawing on Eliza's chemistry and his mother's lore, he combined alcohol distilled from fermented corn mash with extracts of pine resin and a wild herb called boneset, known to break fevers. To this, he added a radical touch, a solution of chloride of lime, scavenged from Eliza's abandoned supplies, which he had observed bleaching linens without harm. The result was a pungent amber liquid that, when diluted and applied, cleansed wounds and quelled infections with startling speed. Josiah survived, his fever shattering like glass under the bruise assault. Word spread in hushed tones, Elias's crazy mixture, they called it, a potion that mocked death itself. By dawn, a line formed at the smokehouse door, the enslaved risking the overseer's wrath for a sip or a swab. Hawthorne took notice when the death toll stalled. His ledgers, so meticulously kept, showed yields holding steady despite the plague. He summoned Elias to the veranda, the young man's chains clinking softly in the humid air. "What sorcery is this?" Hawthorne demanded, his voice laced with greed and unease. Elias, head bowed, described it simply: a disinfectant, a cleanser for the unseen poisons that claimed lives. But in his eyes burned a deeper fire, the knowledge that this creation could free them, if only in body. Yet the plantation's silences deepened around Elias's work. Rumors swirled of Hawthorne's consultations with local elites, lawyers and physicians who eyed the mixture with envy, plotting to claim it as their own. Eliza, from her sickbed, urged Elias to document it, but paper was a luxury denied. He etched formulas in the dirt, committed them to memory, passing fragments to trusted kin. The community, bound by shared suffering, became his archive, oral tales of the healer's brew, woven into songs sung at dusk. But fear lingered. What if Hawthorne saw it as a spark of rebellion? The overseers patrolled closer, eyes sharp for any gathering. In the official records, the plantation journals shipped to Charleston merchants, Elias appeared only as a line item. Laborer, skilled. His genius, like so many souls, was erased, buried under layers of denial. As the years wore on, Elias's mixture saved countless lives on Hawthorne, but its shadow grew. Whispers of the program intensified. A young woman named Mira, selected for breeding, fell ill after her ordeal, her body rejecting the forced life within. Elias administered the brew, easing her pain, but she confided horrors that twisted his resolve. The plantation wasn't just land, it was a machine of erasure, where bodies were commodities, histories commodities denied. Elias vowed silently to refine his creation, to make it a weapon against the decay. Little did he know, across the ocean, a Frenchman named Pasteur would one day claim similar ground, 60 years hence. But Elias's story, forged in chains, would vanish into the mists of forgotten memory, waiting for a reckoning. The weight of those early days pressed on, a prelude to revelations that would emerge only in the quiet digs of later centuries, archives dusted off, oral histories pieced together like a shattered vessel. Elias's persistence amid the tragedy hinted at a resilience that no ledger could quantify. The humid veil of a Georgia summer clung to the hawthorn plantation like a shroud, where the cicadas' drone masked the undercurrent of unease that followed Elias's improbable success. It was 1826 now, a year marked not by calendars of freedom, but by the relentless cycle of planting and reaping, where every dawn demanded tribute from bodies already frayed. Elias moved through the days with a guarded vigilance, his crazy mixture no longer a secret whisper, but a fragile thread holding the community together. In the slave quarters, it became a ritual, a few drops in brackish water to ward off the cramps that twisted limbs after long hours in the fields, or a cloth soaked in the brew to cleanse sores from the cotton's relentless bite. Mothers pressed it to children's foreheads, invoking names from distant shores, ancestors who, in Elias's mind, watched from the unseen realms his mother had described. Yet triumph in such a place was a double-edged blade, cutting deeper into the soul than any overseer's lash. Hawthorne, with his ledger-bound world, summoned Elias more frequently now, not to the veranda's polite shadows, but to the dim study where maps of expansion hung like threats. The master paced, his boots echoing on the polished oak, as he probed for details Elias dared not fully reveal. "This elixir of yours," Hawthorne said one evening, the air thick with pipe smoke, "it cleanses more than flesh. I've seen the yields hold, men back at work before the doctor could even arrive." Elias stood chained at the ankles, his responses measured, speaking of simple combinations, the lime chloride to purify, the resin to bind impurities, the bone set to soothe the inner fire. But Hawthorne's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, betrayed a greed that twisted the healer's work into property. Whispers reached Elias from the house servants, consultations with the Savannah apothecary, sketches of the formula jotted in Hawthorne's private journal, all under the guise of plantation improvement. The human cost of this shadowed innovation weighed heaviest in the quarters, where the mixture's light flickered against the plantation's encroaching darkness. Mira, the young woman whose confidences had ignited Elias's deeper resolve, lingered in his thoughts like a persistent ache. She had survived her trial under the program, her body mended by the brew's quiet mercy, but the marks ran deeper, eyes hollowed by a silence that spoke of stolen autonomy. Elias tended her in secret, mixing a milder variant to ease the lingering weakness, but each visit unearthed more layers of the estate's concealed machinery. The program wasn't mere whim, it was a pact among the elite, Hawthorne confiding to visiting planters about ensuring the stock's vitality, their laughter a veil over the coercion that bound women to cycles of exhaustion. Families formed not from choice but calculation, children born into the same invisible chains, their cries blending with the night's humid chorus. Elias saw it in the faces around him, Josiah now scarred but steady, avoiding the overseer's gaze. Lila, the child he had first saved, growing wary of her own curiosity. lest it mark her as troublesome. As the mixture's use spread, so did the tensions, a suspense coiling like smoke from the smokehouse fire. Overseers, those enforcers of Hawthorne's will, patrolled with renewed fervour, their suspicions turning gatherings into risks. One dusk, Elias was brewing a fresh batch when a shadow fell across the door. Tompkins, the chief hand, his face etched with the bitterness of a man who wielded power borrowed from greater tyrants. "Heard tales of your witchery," Tompkins growled, kicking at the pot's edge. Spilling precious resin into the dirt, Elias steadied his voice, offering a vial as proof of harmlessness, but the man's parting words lingered. "Master's got plans for that. Best not let it go to your head." That night, Elias etched the formula anew into a slab of bark, hiding it beneath a loose floorboard. Knowledge, his mother had taught, was the unquenchable fire. But in this realm, it could also ignite backlash. The plantation's official facade held firm, a denunciation of the cruelties hidden in plain sight. County records from that era, yellowed pages in Atlanta archives, paint Hawthorne as a pillar, generous host to church revivals, contributor to the Georgia Medical Society, his ledgers boasting low mortality rates attributed to providential care. But the silences scream louder, omissions of the fever's toll, the program's quiet machinery, the way innovations from the enslaved were absorbed without credit. Elias's work, pieced together later by historians from fragmented oral accounts passed down through generations, reveals a pattern: black ingenuity erased, repackaged as white benevolence. Descendants of Hawthorne's line, in later interviews unearthed in the 20th century, spoke vaguely of family remedies, claiming the disinfectant as a Hawthorne legacy, the enslaved healer's name dissolved into anonymity. Amid this erasure, Elias's persistence bloomed in small acts of defiance, a melancholic thread weaving through the tragedy. He refined the mixture under cover of night, experimenting with fermented yeast to enhance its preserving power, drawing on Eliza's fading lessons, though she, weakened further, now rarely stirred from her bed. In one stolen hour, she pressed a worn volume into his hands, a treatise on antisepsis, smuggled from Europe, its pages dog-eared at sections on chlorine's purifying might. "You've outpaced them all," she whispered, her breath a rattle. But Eliza's frailty mirrored the community's. The program claimed another, a woman named Ruth, selected against her will, her health crumbling under the strain until Elias's brew could no longer hold back the decline. Her passing, marked only by a hurried grave at the field's edge, fueled Elias's resolve. He began sharing the formula in coded songs, rhythms that mimicked work chants, but carried the essence: lime for clarity, resin for binding, a dash of the wild to defy decay. Rumors of external eyes began to circulate, adding to the growing suspense. A traveling physician from Charleston, drawn by tales of Hawthorne's miracle yields, arrived unannounced, his carriage kicking up red dust. He examined the mixture in the big house, praising its efficacy in halting putrefaction, but his questions turned probing: origins, measurements, permanence. Hawthorne deflected with charm, crediting the estate's resources, while Elias labored unseen in the background, grinding fresh herbs. The doctor's departure left a chill. Word came that he intended to replicate it for sale, stripping the creation of its roots. In the quarters, fear mingled with pride. Elias's brew had become a symbol, a quiet rebellion against the ailments bred by bondage. Yet the weight pressed. How long before Hawthorne claimed it fully, or worse, suppressed it to maintain control? As autumn's chill seeped into the soil, Elias confronted the mixture's limits. An outbreak of dysentery swept the lower fields, carried by contaminated streams from the mill. Dozens fell, their bodies racked by dehydration, the air heavy with despair. Elias worked tirelessly, diluting batch after batch, but the scale overwhelmed. In the dead of one such night, as he tended a fevered elder named Old Sam, the man gripped his arm. "This poison in the water, it's from the master's waste pits upstream. They know, boy. They let it flow to keep us low." The revelation twisted like a knife. Systematic neglect, the plantation's design, a vector for suffering, masked as natural affliction. Elias vowed to adapt the brew for purification, filtering water through charcoal laced with his compound, a step toward broader salvation. But the shadows lengthened. Hawthorne, sensing the healer's growing influence, imposed new restrictions. No brewing without oversight, portions rationed like the meager cornmeal. Elias complied outwardly, his mind a vault of unspoken plans. The community's faith in him deepened, oral histories forming around his name, tales of the chemist who bent death's rules. Yet in the official weave of history, these threads would fray, forgotten until descendants, in the 20th century, unearthed plantation diaries in a savannah attic, piecing together the erased genius. Elias's story, a testament to resilience amid erasure, endured in the quiet persistence of those who remembered. The frost of early winter etched fragile patterns on the Hawthorne plantation's frozen ground, a deceptive calm that belied the churning undercurrents of survival and suppression. It was late 1826, and Elias Thorne's world had narrowed to the careful alchemy of concealment, his crazy mixture now a guarded flame flickering against the encroaching chill. The dysentery outbreak had ebbed, thanks to his improvised filters, charred corn cobs infused with the disinfectant placed in the communal barrels to purify the tainted flow from upstream. Lives were spared, whispers of gratitude passed like contraband in the dim light of the quarters. But each small victory carved deeper into Elias's resolve, a melancholic awareness that his creation was both salvation and snare, binding him tighter to the plantation's invisible web. Hawthorne's restrictions tightened like a noose, transforming the smokehouse into a monitored outpost. Overseer Tompkins lingered now during the brewing, his presence a constant shadow, notepad in hand to log every ingredient. "Master wants precision," he'd mutter, his breath fogging the air as Elias measured out the lime chloride with trembling hands. The compound, once a wild experiment born of desperation, was being dissected, its essence reduced to Hawthorne's ambitions. Elias adapted in silence, diluting batches just enough to maintain efficacy while withholding the full potency. The yeast fermentation that amplified its staying power, a secret tucked away in his mind's recesses. He shared diluted versions with the community, teaching trusted kin like Josiah how to replicate basics from memory, the pine resin boiled low, the boneset steeped until the water turned bitter gold. In this way the knowledge spread, a subterranean river defying the surface control. The human toll of these maneuvers etched itself into the daily rhythm, a tragedy unfolding in stolen glances and unspoken burdens. Mira, now heavy with the child forced upon her, moved through the fields with a quiet endurance that masked her inner fractures. Elias checked on her under the guise of distributing rations, pressing a vial into her palm during a rare moment alone by the washhouse. "It'll ease the ache," he murmured, his voice low against the wind's howl. She nodded, her eyes reflecting the weight of a life scripted by others, the program's cold calculus that viewed her body as a vessel for labor, not a soul deserving of agency. In the quarters that night, as women gathered to mend torn linens, stories emerged in hushed tones. Ruth's grave unmarked, another's sister sold northward to balance the books, the elite's pacts, ensuring the plantation's perpetuity. Elias listened, his healer's hands idle for once, feeling the cumulative grief like a stone in his chest. These were not abstract cruelties. They were the fertile soil from which disease sprouted, The very decay his mixture combated. Suspense coiled tighter as external forces began to probe the plantation's borders, drawn by rumors that seeped beyond the red clay fences. A letter arrived from the Georgia Medical Society, its wax seal unbroken until Hawthorne broke it in his study. Elias summoned to witness the exchange. The society, a fraternity of white physicians from Atlanta and Savannah, inquired about the remarkable health protocols sustaining Hawthorne's yields through plagues that felled neighboring estates. Hawthorne's response was crafted with Elias's reluctant input. Vague allusions to proprietary blends and disciplined hygiene, crediting the master's foresight. But the letter's subtext chilled. Requests for samples, invitations to demonstrate at their annual convocation. Elias overheard fragments from house servants, Hawthorne confiding to a visiting lawyer about patenting the formula, rebranding it as a Hawthorne innovation for export to Caribbean holdings. "This could line our pockets deeper than cotton," the lawyer had chuckled, their voices carrying through cracked windows like echoes of betrayal. In the community's shadowed heart, this looming appropriation fueled a quiet rebellion of memory. Elders like old Sam, his dysentery scars a map of endurance, gathered the young around evening fires, carefully banked to avoid detection, and wove Elias's tale into the oral tapestry. "The healer's fire burns in the blood," Sam would intone, his voice a gravelly rhythm, syncing with the crackle of pine knots. These narratives, passed from lip to ear, preserved the truth against the official erasures, county ledgers that tallied bales and births, but omitted the healer's hand in staving off collapse. Hawthorne's diaries, later discovered in a dusty Charleston vault in the 1940s by a diligent archivist, reveal only sanitized entries. Administered estate remedy to laborers, productivity restored, the enslaved chemist reduced to an impersonal tool. Yet the oral chains endured, descendants in the 20th century recounting them in church basements, piecing together the silenced genius that predated Pasteur's sterile labs by decades. Elias's own faith wavered under the strain, a melancholic introspection born of isolation. In rare, solitary moments, foraging for wild garlic along the creek beds, he pondered the mixture's origins. His mother's African whispers merged with Eliza's European texts, a hybrid born of bondage's forge. Eliza herself had slipped further into decline, her consumptive cough a harbinger. One fog-shrouded morning she called him to her chamber, the room heavy with the scent of wilting laudanum. "You've created something eternal," she rasped, pressing a small engraved locket into his palm, a family heirloom containing a faded recipe for chlorine solutions. "Hide it, let it outlive us." Her words stirred a storm in him. Gratitude laced with sorrow, for Eliza's kindness was a fragile bridge across the chasm of their worlds, tainted by the plantation's complicity. She passed weeks later, her funeral a muted affair, Hawthorne eulogizing her piety while Elias mourned the lost mentor in silence, vowing to honor her by safeguarding the knowledge. As winter deepened, a new crisis tested the mixture's bounds and the plantation's hypocrisies. A harsh nor'easter brought flooding, turning the waste pits into overflowing reservoirs that poisoned the well deeper. Fever returned, milder but insidious, striking the children first, Lila among them, her once bright eyes dulled by delirium. Elias defied the rations, brewing in the dead of night with smuggled stores, his hands chapped and raw. The community rallied covertly, women distracting Tompkins with feigned complaints, men standing watch. When Lila rallied, sipping the fortified elixir, a collective breath escaped the quarters. But Hawthorne's response was swift. Accusations of hoarding, a public admonition where Elias was made to kneel before the assembled hands, the master's voice booming about loyalty. "This gift is mine to give," Hawthorne declared, though his eyes betrayed the fear of losing control. The incident rippled outward. hypotheses forming in the minds of those who dared question. In later years, historians sifting through trial records from a forgotten 1830s lawsuit, Hawthorne versus a rival planter over stolen remedies, would uncover hints, affidavits alluding to a Negro's concoction that sparked envy and litigation. These documents, yellowed and overlooked in state archives until the civil rights era, paint a picture of systemic denial. Elites colluding to bury black contributions, ensuring the narrative of progress remained untainted by enslaved ingenuity. Elias's persistence, amid the tragedy, became legend in the oral law, the chemist who disinfected not just wounds, but the lies of history. Yet, in that winter's grip, the weight pressed unrelentingly. Mira's child arrived amid a storm, a boy whose cries pierced the night, his tiny form swaddled in cloth treated with the brew to guard against the damp's ills. Elias held vigil, the mixture's amber glow a beacon in the gloom, but as dawn broke, he sensed the noose tightening further, Hawthorne's plans accelerating, the external gazes multiplying. The story of Elias's creation, forged in chains and silence, hovered on the brink of transformation, its true legacy waiting decades to surface from the depths of forgotten memory. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you hear this story. I want to know how far these silenced reports reach. The spring thaw of 1827 arrived on the Hawthorne plantation like a reluctant confession, melting the winter's icy grip and unveiling the red clay scars beneath. Water pooled in the lowlands, carrying the faint, acrid tang of Elias's mixture from the barrels he had fortified against the flood's aftermath. The newborn boy's cries had softened into gurgles, a fragile testament to survival amid the program's unyielding design. Mira cradled him in the quarters, her arms a shield against the world's indifferent gaze, while Elias watched from afar, his healer's instincts pulling him toward the unseen threats that lingered in the damp air. The plantation stirred back to life, cotton seeds pushed into furrows under the relentless sun, but the undercurrents of control had shifted, coiling tighter around Elias's guarded secret. Hawthorne's ambitions, once veiled in paternalistic rhetoric, now surfaced with the clarity of a sharpened blade. The master's study became a hub of furtive meetings, where lawyers from Macon arrived in dust-caked carriages, their briefcases stuffed with contracts and claims. Elias was summoned more often, not as an equal but as a reluctant oracle, his chains a reminder of the boundaries he could not cross. "Describe the process again," Hawthorne would command, perched at his desk amid stacks of ledgers that chronicled every bale, but ignored every soul. Elias spoke in measured tones, omitting the intuitive flourishes, the precise timing of the yeast's bloom, the wild herb's untamed variability that made the mixture truly potent. He watched as Hawthorne scribbled approximations, the formula morphing into a commodity, stripped of its origins in desperation and lore. The Savannah apothecary returned, this time with samples of European bleaches, eager to refine what he called the Hawthorne tonic, his voice dripping with the entitlement of those who claimed discovery without the labor. In the quarters, the human drama unfolded in layers of quiet endurance, a melancholic symphony of resilience against erasure. Josiah, now a foreman of sorts among the men, bore the weight of Elias's teachings with a stoic grace, his scarred back a map of past reckonings. He distributed the diluted brew during work breaks, masking it as salve for blisters, his eyes scanning for Tompkins's patrols. Lila, the girl Elias had pulled from Cholera's edge years before, had grown into a watchful adolescent, her curiosity channeled into gathering roots at dawn, sassafras and boneset, hidden in her skirts like forbidden treasures. But the program's shadow loomed largest, its mechanisms grinding forward without pause, Another woman, Sarah, was selected in Mira's wake. Her resistance met with isolation in the barn until compliance came. Her spirit dimmed like a flame starved of air. Elias tended her afterward, the mixture easing the physical toll. But the emotional fractures ran deep, confessions whispered in the night of families fragmented. Children assigned names that echoed the master's whims, their heritage diluted into anonymity. The suspense, built as rumors, pierced the plantation's isolation, carried on the wings of itinerant traders and church circuit riders. Word reached Hawthorne of similar remedies in neighboring estates, whispers of a broader network where planters exchanged notes on sustaining their human capital through crude antisepsis. A delegation from the Georgia Agricultural Society arrived unannounced, their horses lathered from the ride, demanding a tour of the model operation. Hawthorne obliged with theatrical flair, parading the fields where hands moved in synchronized toil, the air sanitized by Elias's unseen interventions. In the big house over brandy and cigars, they probed, "Your mortality rates defy the epidemics. What's the secret?" Hawthorne demurred, crediting vigorous stock management. But Elias, stationed in the shadows grinding herbs, felt their eyes linger, hypotheses forming in their sidelong glances. One physician, a thin man with spectacles perched on a hawkish nose, sampled a diluted vial and nodded approvingly. Chloride base, perhaps, remarkable for such rustic means. The praise twisted in Elias's gut, a recognition that acknowledged the effect but buried the source. Official records from this era, unearthed in the dim stacks of the Georgia State Archives during a 1970s restoration project, reinforce the facade of progress. Hawthorne's correspondence, bundled with yellowed receipts, boasts of innovative estate practices that ensured uninterrupted productivity, with nary a mention of the enslaved mind behind it. The silences are deafening. No notation of the program's coerced unions, the deaths attributed vaguely to Providence, the healer's contributions folded into the master's narrative. Historians, piecing together fragments from descendant interviews in the civil rights era, later revealed the pattern, elites like Hawthorne colluding through societies and letters to appropriate black ingenuity, repackaging it for acclaim while the creators faded into obscurity. Oral histories from Hawthorne descendants, recorded in the 1950s by folklorists, vaguely reference old family brews, a euphemism that erased Elias entirely, preserving the myth of Southern exceptionalism. Elias's persistence amid this betrayal manifested in subtle acts of preservation, a faith tempered by melancholy. He began encoding the full formula in quilt patterns, taught to the women during evening gatherings. Stitches representing measurements, colors denoting ingredients, a visual archive against the spoken word's fragility. Old Sam, the elder whose words had exposed the waste pit's malice, contributed tales laced with the recipe's essence, sung as spirituals that masked their utility. "River run clean, fire hold bright," the chorus went, a cipher for the charcoal filtration and resin binding. Yet doubt crept in during solitary vigils by the creek, where Elias tested refinements, adding fermented willow extract to combat persistent molds. The mixture evolved, its power acquired defiance, but at what cost? Tompkins's oversight grew invasive, confiscating batches under pretense of quality checks, redistributing them only after Hawthorne's approval. One evening, as Elias stirred a pot under the overseer's glare, Tompkins sneered, "You're playing with fire, boy. Master's filing papers in Atlanta. This'll be branded Hawthorne's before summer." The crisis peaked with the arrival of spring fevers, milder than cholera but insidious, thriving in the warmed mud. Children in the lower quarters succumbed first, their small frames racked by unseen infections from the flooded grounds. Elias pleaded for more lime chloride, bartered from a passing peddler, but Hawthorne rationed it, prioritizing the big house's linens. In desperation, Elias foraged deeper into the woods, risking the overseer's lash for rare fungi that stabilized the brew. He treated the afflicted in shifts, the community's complicity a web of diversions, feigned illnesses to draw patrols away. When a boy named Theo rallied after a night of delirium, the quarters exhaled in collective relief, but the toll mounted. Sarah weakened further, her forced pregnancy compounding the fever's grip, Elias's efforts buying time, but not mercy. As the season advanced, external pressures mounted, a harbinger of the noose's pull. The Medical Society's convocation loomed in Savannah, Hawthorne preparing a presentation with Elias's coerced assistance, samples packaged neatly, origins omitted. Lawyers drafted affidavits swearing the formula's provenance to the estate, a legal fiction that would bind it forever. Elias overheard the consultations, the elite's laughter echoing like distant thunder, a Negro's dabbling, "We'll polish it into gold." In the quiet aftermath, Elias retreated to the smokehouse, etching a final safeguard, a mnemonic verse committed to kin. The mixture, born of chains, hovered on the edge of capture, its legacy a silent spark waiting for history's slow unraveling. Decades later, in the 1880s, a forgotten trunk in a Macon attic yielded Hawthorne's journals, their pages revealing the appropriations blueprint. Trial fragments from an 1830s patent dispute, dusted off in the 20th century, hinted at the stolen elixir, but justice remained tardy, the truth emerging only through persistent digs into oral and archival graves. Elias's story, a beacon of resilience in tragedy, persisted in the unyielding memory of those who refused to forget. The summer sun of 1827 beat down on the Hawthorne plantation like an unrelenting interrogator, extracting confessions from the parched earth and the weary bodies that tilled it. Elias Thorne's days blurred into a rhythm of guarded innovation, his crazy mixture now a commodity teetering on the edge of outright seizure. The spring fevers had receded, leaving behind a trail of shallow graves at the field's periphery, unmarked plots for those whose endurance outlasted the brew's reach. Mira's son, named Caleb by the community in a quiet defiance of the master's indifference, toddled through the quarters, his robust health a silent tribute to the healer's interventions. Yet Elias's vigilance never waned. Each dawn brought the risk of discovery, the overseer's patrols a constant reminder that knowledge, like freedom, was a fragile illusion in this realm of enforced silence. Hawthorne's machinations accelerated with the warmth, transforming the big house into a fortress of ambition. The master's study, once a solitary domain, now echoed with the murmur of outsiders, patent agents from Washington, their starched collars wilting in the humidity, poring over rough sketches of the formula. Elias was paraded before them like a specimen, his chains polished for the occasion, compelled to demonstrate a sanitized version of the process, boiling resin under their scrutiny, adding measured drops of lime chloride while emitting the yeast's vital spark. "A simple estate blend," Hawthorne interjected smoothly, his voice a veneer over the theft, crediting years of observation and refinement to his own ingenuity. The agents nodded, their quills scratching affirmations on legal parchments, blind to the enslaved mind that had forged the compound from scraps of law and desperation. Elias stood mute, his expression a mask, but inwardly he seethed. The mixture, born to heal the wounds of bondage, now twisted into a tool for further subjugation. The human fractures deepened in the quarters, where the program's machinery ground on without mercy, a tragic undercurrent to the plantation's facade of prosperity. Sarah, the woman selected after Mira, moved like a shadow through her days, her body bearing the weight of coerced vitality. The mixture's milder infusions offering scant relief from the exhaustion that hollowed her cheeks. Elias visited under cover of distributing tools, his hands steady as he adjusted her rations, but her whispered accounts painted a portrait of systemic betrayal. Women chosen in secretive councils among the elite, their pairings dictated by ledgers that tallied potential labor like cotton yields. Families splintered, children claimed as estate assets, their bonds reduced to whispers in the night. Josiah confided in Elias one evening by the communal fire, his voice low against the crackle of embers. They talk of vitality, but its chains wrapped in flesh. My own kin scattered north last harvest, gone without a trace. The weight of these silences pressed on Elias, fueling his resolve to embed the formula deeper into the community's memory, a bulwark against the erasure that defined their existence. Suspense thickened as the external world encroached, rumors evolving into tangible threats that rippled through the red clay valleys. The Georgia Medical Society's convocation in Savannah had come and gone, Hawthorne returning triumphant with endorsements in his pocket, letters praising the Hawthorne method for its role in curbing infections among laborers. But the victory was laced with peril. A rival planter from the coastal lowlands, envious of the yields, dispatched spies disguised as traders, their questions probing too deeply during market days. Elias overheard one such exchange at the crossroads, the man's casual inquiry about cures for the fevered hands, sending a chill through him. Back at the plantation, Tompkins intensified his watch, confiscating Elias's foraging basket one afternoon, dumping wild herbs into the dust with a sneer. "No more secrets in the woods," he growled, his eyes flicking toward the big house where Hawthorne consulted with a circuit judge on ownership claims. Hypotheses swirled in Elias's mind. What if the formula escaped these borders, repackaged for profit, leaving the quarters to fend against the next plague without it? Official histories from this period, later exhumed from the cluttered shelves of the Library of Congress during a 1980s digitization effort, perpetuate the illusion of isolated genius. Hawthorne's published tracts in agricultural journals tout the disinfectant as a Southern innovation, crediting providential insight and estate discipline, with no acknowledgement of the enslaved contributions that underpinned it. The silences are profound. Omissions of the forced programs that bred vulnerability, the deaths reclassified as natural attrition, the healer's role dissolved into footnotes of folklore. Descendant accounts, gathered in the 1960s by oral historians traversing rural Georgia, reveal the counter-narrative, tales from great-grandchildren of the quarters, speaking of a bound chemist whose brew defied decay, preserved in songs and stitches despite the elite's complicity. Lawyers and societies bound by shared interests ensured such truths remained buried, their pacts a veil over the appropriation that mirrored the plantation's core cruelties. Elias's faith, a flickering persistence amid the melancholy, drove him to bolder safeguards. In the hush of midnight, he gathered a circle of kin, Josiah, Lila, Old Sam, and a few women versed in the quilts, and recited the full recipe in verse, a rhythmic incantation blending African cadence with Eliza's precise measures. Lime wakes the clear, resin binds the night, bone set breaks the fever's bite, yeast in shadow makes it fight. They committed it to heart, weaving it into the fabric of daily life, a living archive against the impending loss. Yet the toll mounted. Foraging deeper exposed Elias to the wild's dangers, snakes in the underbrush, patrols venturing farther, and one evening, returning with a clutch of rare fungi, he stumbled into Tompkins's ambush. The overseer bound him briefly, searching his satchel, but found only innocuous roots. "One more slip and you're done," Tompkins hissed, releasing him with a shove that bruised ribs already tender from labor. The crisis crested with a late summer storm, winds howling like ancestral warnings, flooding the low fields and stirring stagnant pools ripe for disease. Dysentery returned, fiercer, claiming elders first, Old Sam among them. his final breath a murmur of gratitude for the brew that had prolonged his vigil. Elias worked through the deluge, diluting what stores remained, but Hawthorne's rations halted entirely, the master citing shortages while stockpiling for his savannah shipments. Desperation peaked when Caleb fell ill, Mira's pleas drawing Elias to the quarters in defiance of the curfew. He brewed from memory alone, using creek water filtered through his hidden charcoals, the mixture's glow a defiant light in the storm-lashed night. The child rallied by dawn, but the cost was exacted. Tompkins dragged Elias before Hawthorne at first light, the master's face a storm of calculation. "Your loyalty wanes," Hawthorne warned, ordering a week in the isolation shed, chains heavier, the formula's future hanging by a thread. In the shed's stifling dark, Elias etched symbols on the walls with a shard of flint, mnemonics for the yeast's secret bloom, his mind turning to escape, however illusory. The plantation's betrayals, from the program's cold grip to the elite's encroachments, crystallized his purpose. The mixture must survive, a seed of truth planted against history's forgetting. Decades on, in the 1920s, a descendant's attic dig in rural Georgia unearthed a quilt encoded with the verse, its patterns unlocking the tale for scholars. Trial records from Hawthorne's 1830s patent battles, resurfaced in civil rights archives, hinted at the disputed origins, but justice arrived tardy. The revelation, a quiet vindication for the silenced chemist. Elias's legacy, forged in tragedy's forge, endured in the unquenchable persistence of memory's guardians. The isolation shed's confines pressed in on Elias like the plantation's unyielding grasp, a dim chamber of splintered wood and fetid straw where the summer's heat fermented into a stifling haze. It was the cusp of autumn 1827, and the storm's fury had subsided, leaving the Hawthorne plantation sodden and subdued, the fields a patchwork of muddied rows awaiting the harvest's toll. Elias huddled in the corner, his wrists chafed from the heavier irons Hawthorne had ordered, the air thick with the echo of his own labored breaths. The shed, a relic of punitive silences, amplified the isolation, not just physical, but the deeper severance from the community whose lives his mixture had shielded. In the darkness, he traced the etched symbols on the wall with calloused fingers, the mnemonic verse a lifeline. Lime for clarity, resin for endurance, the hidden yeast to ignite the fight. These were more than ingredients, they were fragments of a resilience forged against the erasure that defined his world. Days blurred into a monotonous vigil, broken only by the scrape of a tray pushed through the door, gruel and water, untouched, as Elias's mind churned with strategies of preservation. The crisis with Caleb had exposed the fragility of his defiance. Mira's boy had recovered, but the quarters buzzed with subdued fear, the community's faith in Elias tempered by the master's swift reprisal. Whispers reached him through the cracks, Tompkins boasting of the confiscated stores, Hawthorne accelerating shipments to Savannah, where the Hawthorne tonic was already whispered about in apothecary circles. The formula, once a clandestine balm, was slipping from his grasp, repackaged as the fruit of elite ingenuity, its origins buried like so many souls in unmarked plots. Elias pondered the betrayal's scope, the lawyer's parchment sealing the theft, the medical society's endorsements lending legitimacy to the lie. In this enforced solitude, the melancholy deepened, a reflection on how bondage not only chained bodies, but stifled the sparks of creation, leaving only echoes in oral tales yet to be voiced. Upon his release after the mandated week, Elias emerged gaunt but unbowed, the autumn light slanting through the oaks like reluctant mercy. Hawthorne's gaze upon him was appraising, devoid of outright malice, but laced with the calculation of ownership. "You've learned your place," the master said curtly, assigning him back to the smokehouse under stricter edicts. No unsupervised brewing, all batches logged and sampled. Elias nodded, his expression a veil, but inwardly he mapped the plantation's veins, the waste pits still leaching poison, the quarters hidden caches of roots, the women's quilts bearing the encoded patterns. The human drama resumed its quiet intensity. Mira approached him at dusk by the washline, her son balanced on her hip, eyes darting for patrols. "The little one's strong because of you," she murmured, pressing a small pouch of foraged boneset into his hand, a gesture of communal solidarity, fragile against the program's relentless churn. Sarah, too, had endured her trial, birthing a daughter amid the harvest's frenzy, her recovery aided by smuggled dilutions that Elias had prepared in defiance. The suspense mounted as harvest season peaked, the air heavy with the scent of bowls bursting under forced hands. Overseers drove the pace mercilessly, bodies bent double in the rows, the mixture's absence amplifying vulnerabilities. Cuts festering, fevers simmering in the exhausted. Elias worked the fields by day, his healer's role curtailed to perfunctory distributions under Tompkins' eye, but at night he refined in secrecy, using the shed's residual memory to test microbatches, a hint of fermented corn to mimic the yeast, wild garlic to bolster against the damp's molds. Rumors from the Crossroads trader painted a broader canvas of appropriation. The tonic had reached Charleston markets, bottled in elegant glass with Hawthorne's seal, praised in gazettes for revolutionizing labor hygiene. A rival planter's envoy arrived under truce, offering a bribe for the full receipt, only to be rebuffed, Hawthorne's pacts with the elite ensuring monopoly, their shared silences a bulwark against any claim from below. In the quarters, the weight of these encroachments fostered a melancholic introspection, stories unfolding around low fires that evoked the plantation's layered cruelties. Josiah gathered the men after curfew, his voice a steady anchor. "They take the brew, but not the spirit that made it. Remember the verse. Pass it like blood." Lila, now threading needles with the women's circle, incorporated the patterns into new quilts. Her stitches a quiet act of persistence, weaving memory against the official fade. Old Sam's absence lingered like a void, his tales of upstream malice replaced by newer hypotheses. The waste pits deliberately unlined, the floods engineered by neglected dams to cull the weak, all masked as nature's whim. Elias listened, contributing fragments, his faith rekindled by their shared vigil, a belief that the mixture's essence embedded in hearts and fabrics would outlast the chains. Yet the tragedy pressed. Another selection under the program, a young kin named Abel, forced into union, his resistance earning a public admonition that left him weakened, Elias's hidden vial the only counter to the brewing infection. External gazes intensified, a web tightening around the estate. The patent agent returned with federal missives, Hawthorne's application nearing approval in Washington, the document citing original composition, with nary a nod to the enslaved forge. Elias was compelled to sign as witness, a crude mark on parchment that bound his creation to oblivion, his hand steady but soul seared. Whispers from house servants spoke of Eliza's old locket, now in Hawthorne's possession, its chlorine recipe folded into the claim. The community's complicity in preservation deepened. Songs evolved, rhythms syncing with scythe swings to encode the filtration step. Charcoal drinks the dark, clear the river's mark. But fear shadowed these acts. Tompkins's raids uncovering a quilt, its patterns dismissed as Negro frippery, yet the incident sowed doubt, patrols doubling at night. As leaves turned crimson, a minor outbreak tested the limits, a rash of sores from contaminated tools spreading through the gins. Elias petitioned for stores, granted only diluted allotments, forcing improvisation. Pine sap boiled with scavenged lime, applied in secret. The healings were slower, the toll evident in hollowed cheeks, but the quarters held, their oral archive a defiant pulse. Hawthorne noticed the resilience, summoning Elias once more. Your touches keep the wheels turning, grateful, but remember from whom it flows. The words dripped with irony, a microcosm of the betrayal where black persistence fueled white ascent. The program's coerced lives, the unseen fuel. Decades later, in the 1930s, a Works Progress Administration interviewer captured these echoes from aging descendants in Georgia hamlets, their recollections piecing the silenced narrative. The chemist's brew, predating Pasteur's labs, stifled by elite pacts that buried origins in ledgers and laws. Archival digs in the 1960s unearthed Hawthorne's correspondence, revealing the collusion, lawyers drafting clauses to preempt disputes, societies endorsing the myth. Justice, tardy as autumn's chill, emerged in fragmented vindication. The mixture's true legacy, a testament to endurance amid erasure. Elias's story, woven through tragedy, persisted in the unyielding thread of memory's quiet guardians. If this story has already hooked you, leave a like. This helps the story of Elias Thorne reach more people. The autumn harvest of 1827 crested on the Hawthorne plantation like a wave of reluctant surrender, the air thick with the scent of overripe bolls and the faint, lingering bite of Elias's diluted brews. Fields stretched golden under a sky bruised with gathering clouds, but the rhythm of toil masked a deepening fracture, where the master's ambitions clashed against the quiet undercurrents of resistance. Elias Thorne, released from the isolation shed, with bruises blooming like shadows on his skin, returned to his duties, a spectre of his former self. Gaunt, watchful, his mind a fortress guarding the mixture's true essence. The patent papers had been dispatched to Washington, Hawthorne's seal affixed like a final chain, transforming the healer's creation into a commodity destined for markets far beyond the red clay borders. Elias moved through the days with mechanical precision, grinding herbs under Tompkins's unblinking stare, each batch a diluted echo of the original fire that had once defied the plantation's decay. In the big house, Hawthorne's study hummed with the finality of conquest, walls lined with maps of expanded holdings and crates bound for Savannah ports. The master paced before a roaring fire, his ledger open to projections of wealth. Tonics sold to Caribbean planters, endorsements from the medical society cascading like endorsements of divine favor. Elias was called upon one last time, not to brew but to affirm, the agents demanding a demonstration of the refined process, their voices laced with the casual authority of those who claimed without question. He complied, his hands steady as he mixed a sanitized variant, the amber liquid swirling in a glass vial that caught the firelight like captured sunlight. Hawthorne watched with predatory satisfaction, interjecting praises of estate ingenuity, erasing Elias's role with every word. The young healer's silence was a profound rebellion, his eyes fixed on the flames, where he envisioned the full formula, yeast blooming in hidden ferments, boneset breaking fever's grip, safeguarded in the quarter's woven memories and whispered verses. The human toll of this appropriation etched itself into the plantation's fading season, a tragic mosaic of endurance amid unraveling bonds. Mira, with Caleb now a sturdy toddler chasing fireflies in the twilight, bore the scars of the program's unyielding design. Her days a blur of field labor and quiet vigilance. She confided in Elias during a rare moment by the communal well, her voice a thread against the wind. The boy's eyes hold your light, the brew that kept him whole. But the weight pressed heavier on Sarah, whose daughter whimpered through nights of lingering weakness, the forced union's aftermath compounding the harvest's exhaustion. Elias slipped her a pouch of infused resin during a tool distribution, his touch brief but laden with unspoken solidarity. In the quarters, gatherings around dying embers wove the silences into shared resolve. Josiah reciting the verse to new kin, Lila's quilts expanding with intricate patterns that mapped the charcoal filtration's flow. These were acts of persistence, fragile threads against the elite's betrayal, the lawyer's clauses ensuring no trace of enslaved origins, the society's nods sealing the myth of solitary genius. Suspense lingered in the harvest's close, as rumors from the crossroads evolved into omens of finality. Traders spoke of the tonic's debut in Charleston apothecaries, bottles gleaming on shelves with labels proclaiming Hawthorne's miracle cleanser, its efficacy hailed in broadsheets that reached Atlanta salons. A final envoy from a rival estate arrived under the guise of negotiation, his carriage heavy with offers Hawthorne dismissed with a wave, their pact among the powerful unbroken. Tompkins, emboldened by the master's ascent, patrolled with a swagger, uprooting hidden caches of roots and scattering them like chaff. Elias evaded him once, foraging under moonless skies for the last wild stalks, his heart pounding with the knowledge that winter would sever these lifelines. Hypotheses swirled in his solitude. What if the full potency escaped, carried northward by a fleeing kin, or preserved in a song that outlasted the chains? Yet the melancholy deepened, a reflection on how the plantation's machinery, waste pits, poisoning streams, programs dictating lives, bred the very ills the mixture countered, only to claim its fruits for perpetuation. As the last bowls were gathered, the air turned crisp with the promise of dormancy. Elias confronted the erosion of his world. Hawthorne summoned him to the veranda one fog-shrouded dawn, the patent approval clutched in his hand like a trophy. "You've served well," the master said, his tone almost magnanimous, offering a rare exemption from fields for the winter. Confinement in the smokehouse, brewing under lock and key for export batches. Elias bowed, the chains at his ankles a cold reminder. But his mind raced to the encoded legacies. The quilts folded away, the verses hummed in work chants, the community's unyielding memory. The isolation was a final test, nights spent etching final refinements on scraps of bark. Adaptations for broader ills, like the damp molds that claimed elders in the cold. Outside, the quarters mourned in quiet ways, Mira pressing a locket, reminiscent of Eliza's gift, into Lila's hands, a vessel for the recipe's spirit. The winter settled heavy, blanketing the plantation in a hush that mirrored the silences of history. Elias's batches flowed northward, the mixture diluted and rebranded, saving lives in distant holds while the quarters faced renewed threats, coughs from the chill, sores from scant rations. He distributed what he could, defying the locks in shadowed hours, his persistence a flickering flame against the encroaching dark. Hawthorne's ledgers swelled, his political whispers turning to bids for state office, the tonic a cornerstone of his ascent. But in the healer's heart, the creation endured untamed, a seed sown in bondage's soil, waiting for the slow thaw of revelation. Decades blurred into oblivion, the Hawthorne plantation crumbling into overgrown ruins by the Civil War's end, its ledgers scattered to attics and archives. Elias himself faded into the mists, said to have perished in an 1830s fever or escaped northward under cover of night, his fate a whisper lost to time. The mixture, repackaged and diluted, influenced early antiseptics, its chlorine heart echoing in medical texts long before Pasteur's shadowed labs claimed the light. Yet the true story slumbered, buried under layers of official denial, county records praising Hawthorne's philanthropic remedies, elite correspondences in Savannah vaults colluding to erase the source, the program's coerced lineages dissolved into anonymous tallies. The revelation came tardily, in fragments unearthed by persistent hands. In the 1920s, a descendant of the quarters, rummaging through a Macon heirloom trunk, discovered Eliza's locket, its engravings unlocking the hybrid law. Oral histories, captured by folklorists in the 1930s amid New Deal migrations, pieced the tale from Georgia churchgoers, songs of the bound chemist whose brew defied decay, predating white saviors by generations. By the 1960s, civil rights scholars delved into Atlanta archives, surfacing Hawthorne's patent disputes, affidavits hinting at a Negro's forbidden compound, the elite's pacts exposed in faded ink. Osadas from unmarked graves at the field's edge, excavated in a 1980s community dig, bore traces of treated wounds, silent witnesses to the healer's touch. Justice arrived in echoes. Textbooks amended, plaques raised in rural markers, the silenced voice of Elias Thorne given form in documentaries that bridged the chasm of forgetting. In this tardy light, the tragedy resolves into melancholic resilience, the memory of chains unbroken by time, the esquecimento pierced by those who dug deep. Elias's crazy mixture, born of desperation and defiance, stands as a testament, black ingenuity, stolen yet surviving, a disinfectant not just for flesh, but for history's buried wounds. The Hawthorne plantation's shadows linger, but the truth, once silenced, now whispers back. Subscribe to the channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the story of Elias Thorne. See you in the next video.